Well, hello, and a very time zone appropriate salutation to you. Welcome to What the Trans?
What the trans?
Yes, What the Trans, a podcast by and for the trans. So, yeah, that's us. How are you, Michelle?
I'm good. I'm good now. This podcast is a week later than we wanted to be because I had to go to the dentist and have something horrible happen to inside my gob, and it wasn't pleasant. But as you can hear now, I am fully recovered and able to speak. I'm able to enunciate. I'm able to say words with mouth.
Excellent. So, in some ways, that's an improvement on several of our previous episodes, isn't it, really? So,
Oh yeah, my mouth is better than ever before.
Splendid. I'm sure
Just
someone
ask all the guys around my house last night. Ha 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 ha. Bit of blue.
I know.
Bit of blue for Dad.
Yeah, that's what I was going for, but I just couldn't think of the right joke. And you just beat me to it. But yes. So yeah, well, I moved house, right? So I'm in my shiny new studio now, which looks quite a lot like my old studio in that it is in fact my bedroom. But it's a slightly bigger bedroom with a larger window that's actually got a view. So I kind of won on this one. It's not bad. And this'll make you nice and jealous. Like, you as a sort of shoebox London dweller, I've got a balcony.
Yeah, I saw your pictures of your balcony. And
yeah, I sent them to you and went, look at my balcony. Isn't it amazing?
I know you did. I know you did that. And I also know that because you are in Manchester, you probably pay half the price for your balcony, mansion.
Yeah. I mean, it's still an apartment, really. But anyway, okay. I think that's enough sort of opening witter. Shall we do the thing?
There is a lot.
There is a lot, and part of that is because we are a little bit late. But also February, being February, is also here in the UK LGBT History Month. And so the structure, the content of this episode was initially going to be massively historically based. Then there were several quite large news items, so we rejigged it and replanned it. Then something happened that meant I had to completely rewrite my contribution, but we'll get into that later. So, yes, this episode has been a long time coming and a little bit more of a faff than we might normally like. But here we are now to fill your ears with all of the things, starting with, as we always do, the terrible news.
Okay, so to start, the big story of the last couple of months seemingly has been the ongoing nonsense over trans women in sport, which is a subject that neither me or Ashleigh are entirely capable of commenting on with any authority because neither of us do the sports. We don't do any of the sports balls, we don't do any of the sports jumping or the running or the throwing or the any of that. We are just lay trans people going about our lives. But this has been the source of a constant debate in the media for the last few years. It was originally kicking off with the MMA fighter Fallon Fox's emergence onto the professional MMA scene back in 2013, but has recently gone into overdrive as Dr. Rachel McKinnon became the first trans woman to win a cycling world title back in October last year. Since then, Dr. McKinnon has been called up to debate her validity as an athlete and defend herself from accusations of cheating because she is trans, and she has been sort of bouncing around various media outlets being the caller trans to comment on this story, which must be very tiring for her. Since then, famous cisgender athletes from all over the place have stepped up to say that they believe that trans women have an unfair advantage in sports, in spite of the fact that trans women have been competing in sports for decades, and Dr. Rachel McKinnon is the first trans woman that I've ever heard of who has won at a world championship level. The latest round of ridiculousness began when former Wimbledon champion Martina Navratilova wrote in the Times that you can't just proclaim yourself a female and be able to compete against women. There must be some standards, and having a penis and competing as a woman would not fit that standard. She then went on to say, to put the argument at its most basic, a man could decide to be female, take hormones if required by whatever sporting organisation, win everything in sight, and perhaps earn a small fortune, and then reverse his decision and go back to making babies if he so desires. It's insane and it's cheating. I am happy to address a transgender woman in whatever form she prefers, and thank you for that, Martina. You are so fucking gallant.
Yeah, magnanimous of you there. Well done. Really appreciate that. Carry on.
And then she went on to say, but I would not be happy to compete against her. It would not be fair. She wrote this in
Fair.
spite of the fact that she played against a trans tennis player, Rennie Richards, 3 times and won every time. She says this in spite of the fact that her little hypothetical has never fucking happened and will never fucking happen. Can anyone in their right mind picture a situation where a man in the prime of his life in his 20s will gladly give up his ability to get erections, which is what hormones do, in the prime of his life, just so he could win at sports? I don't know a single man who would give up his dick, essentially, to do that. That is completely absurd.
Yes, it seems a bit beyond the pale, doesn't it? But
it does. And she further went on, and she claimed all of this in spite of the fact that the International Olympic Committee has welcomed trans women to compete at the Olympics since 2003. And I would trust them to know more about the ins and outs of sports biology than her, because they have actually sought out the advice of endocrinologists and sports physicians and people who go to fucking school in this shit. But in spite of all of this, marathon runner Paula Radcliffe, former Olympians Dame Kelly Holmes and Sharon Davies have voiced their support for Navratilova, and the media is more concerned in getting clicks from controversy than looking at the simple truth that sports organisations across the world have already looked into this and have allowed trans people to compete because it is the right thing to do, and the science adds up and supports our side. So if you are a trans sports person, please keep competing. You deserve to aim for the stars and do the thing that you love to the best of your ability. Even though you doing that, to me, I don't know how anyone can enjoy doing that stuff. Because, walking upstairs is a nightmare. Why would you want to effectively move around for hours at a time? It's beyond me. But if that's your thing, keep doing it. Don't let these fuckers stop you. Stonewall and Pride Sports have both issued statements in support of trans people. So we people have got our backs on this. What do you say about all this stuff, Ashleigh? It's completely absurd, right?
It is, yeah. And just listening to the litany of nonsense that Martina Navratilova, yes?
I don't know why you're asking me how to pronounce this, because the thing that the listeners won't have heard is me messing up that name about 8 times.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
Whilst trying to get through that. I might release that on Twitter later on, just a little compilation of me fucking up that name, but
yeah, just put it
don't
on
ask me.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So the Wimbledon player who sort of started all of this off, she just sounds like a dickhead, frankly, who's done little to no reading on the subject. And it's so, okay, hang on. There's a dichotomy here as well, because which is it? Is it that trans people remain incredibly overpowered and muscular even after hormone replacement therapy, which, just for reference, we absolutely do not. I cannot even lift my own bass amp anymore. So either it's that trans people retain their strength and are so unbelievably overpowered that we just defeat everybody else at sports, or we're too weak and sensitive to serve in the military. Which is it? Seriously, which is it? Will somebody please make a decision? It's just the same old bullshit again, isn't it? And the thing, it's interesting that Paula Radcliffe is still being cited as a source and listed, considering the most famous thing she didn't involve her particularly winning a race so much as shitting during one. And it's who the fuck even are you, cis woman from 10 years ago? But as you said, the science is 100% on our side here. It bears that out, as the IOC, the Olympics Committee, determined in 2003. And so seeing this whole thing come up again and again, being aimed at a sort of small group of trans people who do participate in sports and who are quite good at it, like Dr. McKinnon, and it just can be incredibly frustrating and invalidating. But something that not a lot of media outlets have picked up from this is, anecdotally, people that I know socially on Facebook and Twitter who are trans women, who are on a football team or whatever, who are just saying, well, look, no one's pointing out the fact that, so one of them said, oh, well, my football team, which has 2 or 3 trans women on it, played against a team with no trans women on it and lost 3-0. So it's clearly not conferring any given particular advantage to be trans in sports. Demonstrably, that is the case. So these people, Navratilova and Paula Radcliffe and Dame, whoever it was, are just talking out of their asses, as so many cis people do when they comment on trans issues. So
Did you see that thing that was in Scotland? It was on the Nine show in Scotland. Rachel McKinnon went on with Sharon Davies,
I see.
and if you didn't see it, I would say go check out an iPlayer. It is a sight to behold. Basically, there's Rachel McKinnon there, basically outlining step by step all of the reasons why Sharon Davies is full of it, and like citing sources and stuff. And then she's tweeting out later all of the studies that she's looked at. But then after all that, Sharon Davies just said, "Well, I dispute that science because trans people are bigger."
For Christ's sake.
It's like, wow, well done.
I dispute science. Okay, so she's probably like an anti-vaxxer then, isn't she, really? If she's going to disagree with an empirical system of knowledge about how the world works. Anyway, so yes, it's terribly frustrating, but it's nothing we've kind of not seen before, and this must be so frustrating as a trans person who is even just trying to play sports, because while this discussion is going on, I can't imagine it being a terribly welcoming environment, and it's not, not seen as one as it is, and there are so many people doing a lot of hard work to try and break down those barriers of homophobia and transphobia in sport, and this stuff doesn't help with that at all, not one itty little bit. So
yeah, I'd like to cut to the part where we're making sports movies about this, about how the trans woman's trying to compete, and she's just facing, they're usually German villains in this. I don't know why. Like the villains in Cool Runnings, I think were German or Swiss or somewhere around there. One of the Germanic countries. And the trans woman has to overcome all of that stuff. I'd quite like to get to that point where those movies are being made, rather than the interim of just all this nonsense.
Yeah, basically. Can we just skip straight over to that part? That would be so much better. Yeah, so that's probably enough of that, isn't it? So let's crack on with our next story. And so someone else that we've spoken about before is Ruth Hunt, who is the chief exec of Stonewall. And it has been recently announced that she will be stepping down from that role in August of this year after 4 years at the helm. Ruth became CEO in 2015, and she has really spearheaded Stonewall's inclusions of trans issues in its activism remit. Previously, Stonewall had only campaigned on LGB issues, and was long criticised for doing so, but better late than never. Stonefall? Stonefall, that sounds like a fantasy town, doesn't it? The village of Stonefall. So Stonewall has now become one of the genuinely globally leading organisations fighting for trans rights, and their work campaigning for Gender Recognition Act reform, as well as now, as we've seen just this week, fighting for the rights of trans athletes, and developing programs aimed at empowering trans people, and it's all been incredibly helpful and a boost to our community. So Ruth's work in making life better for British trans people really cannot be underestimated. In a statement posted on the Stonewall website, she wrote, "I've decided it's time for someone else to lead this fantastic organisation and take it into the next chapter. The next 6 months will be my last, but 6 months is not a short amount of time, and I'm determined to make it count as much, if not more, than any other." So the chair of Stonewall, who's Jan Gooding, has tweeted her support for Ruth as she winds down her Stonewall career, as well as reassuring the trans community that Stonewall's work towards trans equality is going to continue. So the statement for that said, the full board of trustees, staff, team, and overwhelming majority of our supporters are absolutely committed to our work on trans equality, and that will not change when our CEO changes. However, in spite of all of this sort of lovely positivity, support and reflection, and thanks to a really quite remarkable person, conspiracy theories have of course now begun circulating around the reasons why Ruth has decided to step down. So the Times, of course, published a story headlined "Stonewall Drives Away Backers with Trans Agenda," which tried to link the stepping down with a number of former Stonewall board members and several high-profile individuals withdrawing support from the organisation because they're horrible and transphobic and fine, we don't really want you around anyway. But Ruth has indirectly already rejected this particular assessment. She tweeted, "I've also really enjoyed the conspiracy theories about my departure after 14 years. I know it's hard to believe in this day and age, but sometimes things are exactly as described." Ruth, should you happen to be listening to this, thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done. You're incredible and a true ally, and we do owe you a great debt for being there with us during the last 4 years. So, and anybody who's listening who's got the spoons for it, please do send Ruth many nice tweets, emails, and messages. I remember the announcement when Stonewall decided it was going to become trans-inclusive, and it hadn't been beforehand. And it had actually been really quite severely criticised by a lot in the trans community because not just being not trans-inclusive, but being actively unhelpful and grossly offensive sometimes as well. And so when it was first announced, Stonewall are becoming trans-inclusive, this is what we're going to do, I'll be like, yeah, okay, fine, I'll believe that when I see it. And honestly, I am seeing it. And obviously the public spearhead for this has definitely been Ruth Hunt.
It can't be understated how much she has done for us. Like, this has not been an easy job to have for the last 4 years.
Certainly not on Twitter.
No, the amount of abuse that she will have received will have... I mean, for a lot of people, it will have done a number on their mental health. So even if that is a factor, can't really blame her for stepping down. But she's never shown that, if that is the case. She's always been strong in the public eye. She has always been steadfast in her defence and support of and for the trans community. So, again, Ruth, if you happen to be listening, thank you so much. You are an incredible person, and allies like you don't come around that often. So enjoy your retirement, and whatever you go on to next, may it be fruitful and lovely. And yeah, everyone listening, go send her a nice message on Twitter or something and tell her how wonderful she is.
Do the thing. And obviously, Ruth, if you happen to be listening, like, I actually happened to have met Ruth Hunt a couple of times, and there was one occasion where she had just this amazing purple suit. And it's like, I want that. Where do I get that from? And now I think I can ask her because it's not being unprofessional, because it's not... Anyway. Yeah.
She is a sharp dresser. That is another thing. She can wear a suit.
Yeah, for true. Anyway, I think, let's not break our arms jerking her off too hard.
Fair enough. Let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah, which is slightly less fun, isn't it, really? So,
yeah, so we've talked about the trans people in sports thing, which nobody seems to be able to shut up about. Now we're going to talk more about the trans people in prisons thing, which is another thing that nobody seems to be able to shut up about.
Yeah.
So recently, in the last few days, the Times, as well as other national newspapers, but mostly the Times, have been reporting the opening of a new prison unit housing only trans women, at Downview Women's Prison near Sutton in London, like about 2 minutes down the road from where I'm sat right now. In the reports floating around, there have been various claims, including that this is the first trans unit in a prison in Europe. There has also been the claim that almost half of trans prisoners are sex offenders in British prisons, which is not true, and I'll get into that again later. And that all women's jails, except Downview, could be emptied of trans inmates and have them all transported to this new unit. It is safe to say that these reports give the impression that this is a new initiative for removing trans people from the general population of the general prison population for cis people's protection. Understandably, this has caused serious alarm amongst transgender people, as trans inmates being considered dangerous because they are trans and hidden away from the rest of the population would be abhorrent. And none of us intend to commit crimes. None of us intend to go to prison. But, life is funny, and you or I, Ashley, could end up in prison at some point. It could happen. In 20 years, we could try and rob a bank. That situation might happen. So
honestly, I'm kind of up for robbing a bank in 20 years. I don't really have any other retirement plan, and my plan so far has been, well, civilization's probably going to have collapsed by then, so I don't really need a pension.
Yeah, our retirement plan as a generation is pretty much climate change and, knowing how to use a crowbar. But
anyway, sorry, carry on.
Thankfully, this is not the case according to the Ministry of Justice. In a statement released to us here at What the Trans, an MOJ spokesperson stated, in this case, 3 women with gender recognition certificates will be held together on one separate wing of a female prison, without access to other offenders at the prison. This is not part of a wider policy for managing transgender offenders, and indeed is not intended to be used more widely. This seeks to manage the unique risks posed, in this case, by 3 prisoners who also have gender recognition certificates and are therefore legally women. The statement then goes on to make it clear that this is not a sign of a policy change, and this is not going to be used more widely. I myself spoke on the phone earlier with the Ministry of Justice, and they assured me that this is a decision that has been made for 3 specific cases based on a combination of factors. I will say this again. This is not the start of some new policy to separate all trans inmates from the general population, no matter what the press wants you to believe. Maybe there is a conversation that needs to be had about the rights and wrongs of separating these 3 prisoners from the general population. One that maybe one day we will get into here on the podcast. But as of right now, this is not a wide-ranging policy or anything like it. Simply put, the Times, as well as other papers, including The Independent and the BBC News website, have reported on this inaccurately. We will publish a full statement released to us on our website. There will be a link in the description of this episode, as there usually is. Also, the claim that half of transgender inmates are sex offenders, which is doing the rounds again, is not accurate. And this is why. Basically, the half of trans inmates are sex offenders claim originates from a Freedom of Information request by the BBC made last August that stated that 60 out of the 125 transgender inmates in England and Wales were serving time for sexual offences. But this came with serious caveats, including that the 125 transgender prisoners did not include trans people with a gender recognition certificate. It probably won't include trans prisoners serving shorter sentences because trans people, when they're in prison on a longer sentence, they have a case conference and they try to get moved to the more appropriate prison, whereas trans people who are in for short sentences don't bother because they're going to be out soon. So they don't ever raise their hand up and say that they're trans. And the Ministry of Justice said themselves that these numbers are highly unlikely to reflect the reality of the prison situation. Again, we will link to this in the description. As per usual, the media is painting a picture of trans prisoners that just isn't so, because the fiction of trans women being dangerous is just too alluring. Don't fall for this shit.
Well, thank you, I won't.
I mean, I knew you weren't. I was talking to the listener. You, listener, don't fall for this shit. Ashleigh.
Yes. Well, and so there's a whole bunch of conversations to be had about prisons and their place in society, and indeed their the ethics and the necessity and all of that sort of thing, which is a valid conversation. But while they are here, and while this is the system in which we are in, we're going to have to talk about them. But the thing that struck me about this whole thing is that these 3 women have got a gender recognition certificate. So, they are, as far as the law is concerned, women. So why then are they being separated out? Because logically, if you've got a gender recognition certificate, that means that you're A-OK in the general population wherever, except obviously it's not always the case, which is why we want to reform the gender recognition certificate. But, that's a whole thing for another time. So why are these women being separated out? Do you know? Has there been sort of issues?
Well, they couldn't really tell me because of, privacy and, data protection and all sorts of other stuff. But, I mean, this is me going out on a huge limb, and take this with a huge grain of salt, but they wouldn't move these prisoners unless they believe that they wouldn't move these prisoners unless they believe that these certain prisoners were a potential danger to the rest of the population. I don't know who these 3 women are. I don't have any specific information, and if anybody says that they know who these people are, they're lying, because they're not releasing that information to the public or to journalists or to anyone. But based on what they sent me and the conversations I've had with them today, this is not a transgender unit in the same way that they have in America, where they just stick trans people in, no matter what their crimes are, to keep them away from the general population. For their own safety or for the safety of others, or any other reason that they will come up with. This is very much a unique situation that may be a response to the Karen White story that's been going around. That may be a factor as well, but honestly, based on what they sent me, I just don't know. But the only thing that I know for sure is that this is not part of some new initiative that's going to result in every trans person finding themselves on a trans wing somewhere. At least that's not what they're saying today. That might change, but right now, today, that is what the Ministry of Justice is saying.
Rock and roll. Okay, I mean, so there's things that we don't know, but it's still kind of, there's the potential for concern there. But again, it's not being helped by the Times reporting on it grossly inaccurately. But, again, they don't care about that. So,
No, they are definitely trying to report this in a way to affect more change in the policy for trans prisoners.
And not in a good way.
No, they're trying to say that this is a good idea, that this almost fictional view that this is a transgender wing for transgender prisoners and all trans people should go there. That is a better idea than the system they've got now, which that is terrifying, to be honest with you. But, I mean, I would be very interested to talk to these women after they get out, to get their side of things. I would also be very interested to know of the circumstances of how they got moved and why, like from the prison service specifically. But then I don't think that's ever going to happen. Like, I don't know. There's just too many unknowns here.
Yeah, I know, but it's still of a concern. And again, it's the media using it as a stick to beat us with. So, what else is new? But it's kind of been a big couple of weeks for that sort of thing as well, because our next story has also involved us doing a bit of journalistic digging. So we talked about how the press is pillorying trans people just literally constantly. And we've talked about how sports people have objections and about how people who write newspaper articles about prisons have objections. But now here's a story around every trans person in the UK's favourite institution, the NHS. And a story that has cropped up because essentially the Health Secretary has said that he will look into the rules about trans people being on hospital wards with non-trans fellow patients, essentially, which is definitely concerning. So, on Monday the 4th of March, which as we record this is yesterday, Health Secretary for the UK, Matt Hancock, told listeners of radio station LBC that he would be looking at how NHS hospitals will treat transgender women. So Hancock was a guest on the Nick Ferrari show, who received a question from a caller concerning an alleged incident anonymously reported to the Daily Telegraph back in January, where a trans woman was apparently masturbating in front of patients on a ward. Ferrari relayed the story to Hancock, who in response said that he would review the policy. So we here at the podcast have actually reached out to the Department for Health and Social Care to clarify what this means. And a spokesperson for the department told us that this isn't an official review and that we will simply involve our Secretary of State reviewing the existing policy with NHS England and the Government Equalities Office. And they then went on to outline the current policy, which is that trans people are treated as they present. There's no need for a GRC or a legal change of name or a deed poll or anything else. So the original report back on this story, which was in the Telegraph, as I said, back in January, had claimed that an anonymous source had contacted them about a transgender patient who was masturbating on a female ward in front of elderly patients. But there have been no other reports from this. No other anonymous or indeed non-anonymous reports were made to any other publications. And details on the event are thin to, well, more or less non-existent. So we don't know exactly what happened there, but now this report seemingly has resulted in the Minister for Health conducting a review on the policy. So we've reached out again to the Department of Health to confirm if this was the case, but as we record this, we haven't heard anything back. So this is concerning, of course, because if genuinely a full-on policy review is taking place, as has been suggested by a lot of newspapers, then that could be concerning if they decide, oh, well, we just have to build our own wards for trans people and they'll probably be less good and probably located in really out-of-the-way places. But I think the more likely scenario is that this story is either not true or grossly misrepresented or any one of a number of other things. So, yeah, what do you think of this? What do you make of it?
Well, the idea that the Health Secretary is going to do a review that sounds completely informal and just sounds like something he said to get out of a tough spot in an interview.
Right? That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, but it's worrying that that any kind of review is going to happen because of an anonymous report in the Telegraph, which there is no... I mean, there's no other details from this, apart from one anonymous nurse somewhere who claims this has happened with no other... Like, there's been no other witnesses consulted. There's been no other sources consulted about this thing. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't imagine for a second that any nurse in the NHS would make something up like this. But at the same time, there's always more sides to this kind of thing. You know, like we don't have the full picture, but this shadow of a picture is being used to push the Health Secretary to do reviews on our rights and our rules. That is terrifying.
So we'll see where that goes. Hopefully nowhere. Hopefully it was just a throwaway answer. Oh, stop bloody asking me about trans people kind of response. And it is legitimately, like an informal review, as they have said it is. I think honestly that's the best outcome, but we shall see. So there could well be more to the story. But I think we should pick things up a little bit now.
Yeah, let's do some good news, right?
Yeah, let's do that.
So, an open letter supporting trans rights has been published in the National in Scotland. The open letter states, "We, the undersigned, are a large and diverse group of women who are committed to ensuring that trans people feel welcome and safe within our society." Hell yes. Recently, there has been a rise in ill-informed articles and commentary where writers have continually insinuated that trans women are not women. These same pieces misrepresent current legal statutes, equality policies, and public attitudes in Scotland. It then goes on to say, trans people have played an integral role in every civil rights movement to date, from LGBT equality to women's causes. Attempts to airbrush trans people from conversations regarding equality and human rights, or to exclude them from advancements for LGBT and women's rights, have happened before. Such efforts may have re-energized, but they are nothing new. And we say as a collective of women, they are not representative of us. We support trans rights. The letter was signed by over 160 women, including two-time Academy Award winner Dame Emma Thompson, SNP MP Mary Black, artist Cat Smith, and many, many more journalists, artists, writers, teachers, all sorts. How cool is that?
It is pretty damn cool. It is damn cool. And so this came out on Sunday, so 2 days ago as we record this, and Sunday for trans people in the UK is, oh yay, Broadsheet Transphobia Day, essentially. No, it is, like, legit. You just
I agree. I just never heard it said like that before, but yeah, it's true. I do dread Sundays now. Yeah,
you just go to bed on a Saturday night with dreadful anxiety about what the morrow will bring. But this particular Sunday, I mean, there might have been some nonsense spewing forth from the Times' hatch, but this was the thing that I saw. This was the thing that had traction. And gosh, did it cheer me up. I love Emma Thompson. She's brilliant. So, yeah. And it's about... Well, it's about solidarity, and it's about letting the trans community know that some people do have its back, and it's good. Yeah, this was great. This was kind of, it cheered me up. As I said, I just moved house. We did a warming party. I was a little bit hungover on Sunday. It was just the tonic. So,
yeah, we will link to it again. We'll link to it in the description, so you can give it a read yourself. Read out all the names. Reach out to the people in it, obviously, and tell them thanks for the support.
And it's actually the full text of the letter is well worth a read. It is pretty glorious. So and that's on, as I say, that's the National, a newspaper in Scotland. So yes, but yes, I think we want to try and keep the positivity up for our last couple of news items. So. Second to last is a story about a non-binary author who has been nominated for the Women's Prize in Fiction. Nigerian author Okweke Emizi, who identifies as non-binary, has been nominated for the Women's Prize for the book titled Freshwater, which is out now and has received rave reviews. And this makes Emizi the first non-binary author to be nominated for the prize. So, talking to The Guardian, Professor Kate Williams, who's the chairperson of the judges, said of the nomination, "It's a historic moment. We're very careful not to Google the authors while judging, so we didn't know about their gender identity. But the book found great favour among us. And looking at the author's Twitter feed, they are very happy to be nominated, so check out the book. It's called Freshwater. It's out now. It's by a non-binary author who has made history by being nominated for the Women's Prize in Fiction. So yes, check it out. Freshwater by Okweke Emizi.
Yeah, I'm going to try and check that out. I've got a big stack of books I've been trying to get through, but I had no idea this book existed. I had no idea.
Yeah, no.
It completely went over my head, and usually I try and keep my ear on the ground about this kind of thing. But yeah, well done, Okweke. You are fantastic, if you happen to be listening.
Yes.
Okay, and the very last thing, which is kind of old news, but I really wanted to sort of, we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, I kind of wanted to bookend it, as it were, and you probably already heard about this, but whatever. The Big Lottery Fund has finished their review of the trans kids charity Mermaid and have decided that the proposed £500,000 grant will go ahead. This was after a backlash led by Graham Linehan and his gaggle of ghouls as they attempted to halt the grant, but they've decided against it and said that mermaids are pretty good. This comes after YouTube H-Bomber Guy held his infamous charity stream where he raised £260,000 for the charity whilst playing Donkey Kong for almost 3 straight days. So, we can now sort of close the book on that particular chapter, and mermaids have got like £750,000 out of all this stuff. So it's a good result, right?
It certainly is. And so this grant of 500,000 isn't, it doesn't come in as a lump sum. It's like paid out over the course of several years. So that's like ongoing, significant financial support for mermaids, plus this nice boost of cash from Harris's stream. So yeah. This is super, and absolutely we want to talk about this because, as you say, it sort of closes it off nicely, although it does make me wonder, so what's Linehan and his, cavalcade of cunts going to do next?
I don't know, and I don't really care at this point. At the moment, Linehan is still going with his never-ending stream of hatred towards trans people, but he's sort of been pushed to the back seat now with all this sports talk that's been going on, so...
I'm surprised he's not weighed in on that. Or maybe he has and I've missed it because, I don't look at him on Twitter.
I used to check in on it just every few days just to see if he's, if there's any... Because he was always a good place to go to sort of see where the next, stick is coming to beat us with. But at the moment, he's sort of been repeating himself, and so I just haven't really looked at him for a long time now.
And that's fair, and nor should we. And I think there is one final and particularly exciting bit of news for you, isn't there?
Pose is coming to iPlayer on March the 21st, the show that I have been ranting about since the start of this podcast as the best show I have ever seen, is actually going to be shown on British television. It's going to be shown on BBC Two on March 21st, and it'll all be on iPlayer over the coming weeks. So I will, of course, be tweeting madly about this and probably be doing live tweets and stuff on the What the Trans Twitter. So yeah, check it out and follow What the Trans on Twitter, just at What the Trans, and let's watch Pose together.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that because I've failed to watch it. It's been a question of time, but also I've not subscribed to any streaming services that have it, and I'm really, really rubbish at finding things in ways that other people seem to be really good at, where it's just like, oh, you can use a torrent, and I'm like, I don't even really know what one of those is. So, yeah, I'm really happy to finally have the ability to watch Pose and not feel guilty about it. I
only got to watch it because I have a friend who works in, media post-production-y stuff, so that's the only way I could get a hold of it till now. But now, finally, everyone in the UK can watch this amazing, amazing show.
Wunderbar.
Right, okay, so that's the news done, and basically this episode was going to be our trans history special because it was LGBT History Month in February, but obviously Ashleigh had to move house and I had to go get my gob seen to by a dentist. So now it's our better late than never trans history special, where basically me and Ashleigh have separately gone away and researched into a famous trans person each from history, and the other person has no idea who we're going to be talking about. So it's just as much as a surprise to us as it will be a surprise to you, hopefully. So I'm going to go first. Is that all right, Ash?
Of course it is, yeah. Take it away.
Okay. So, here we go. Charles Guinevere Louis Auguste Andre Timothée d'Eon de Beaumont was born on the 5th of October in 1728 in the small town of Tonnerre in Burgundy, which is right slap bang in the middle of France. Charles was born to Louis d'Eon de Beaumont and Francois de Charenton. The d'Eons were a noble family who were awarded lands and titles in the 1600s, but presumably the d'Eons had hit hard times as Charles, as she was called at the time and was raised male at the time. She was born into a poor household. Not poor like hungry poor, but poor for a noble house that had lands and titles. Her father worked as an attorney before moving into local politics, whilst her mother, Francois, was the daughter of a general in the French army. So she was born and raised in relative comfort compared to many living in France at the time, but for a noble family line, not so much. Also, she was raised as a boy and would continue to live in the world as a man until much later in her story. From now on, I'm going to refer to Charles, Guinevere, Louis, blah, 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 as simply Deon, because this isn't Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. We can't get away with a 5-hour-long podcast here. In her youth, she excelled at school and went on to graduate in civil and canon law at the Collège Mazarin in Paris in 1749. But after several years working as an administrator for the royal family, she then up and turned towards a new profession, being an actual goddamn spy.
Nice.
In 1756, she joined the Secret de Roy, English translation, the King's Secret, a secretive spy network that the government was completely unaware of and answered directly to King Louis XV. Her first mission was a secret assignment in Russia, where she and her fellow spies sought out the pro-France factions to combat the English's attempts to deny the French access to Russian Empress Elizabeth. The English were attempting to institute a rule where only women and children were allowed to cross the border into Russia. Now, Deon claimed that during this time she had to disguise herself as a woman to avoid a certain death at the hands of the English, and she even claimed to work for a time as a maid of honour to the Empress. However, there is not any evidence to support this, and I will go into more detail on why she may have been less than accurate about her history later on. She stayed in France for a few years, working at the French embassy until returning home to France in 1760. She continued to present as male, and in 1761 she became dragoons captain in the army, because why not? She'd already been a spy, now she just wants to go kill some people. The dragoons were basically mounted infantry on horses, and tended to be on the vanguard leading the charge, getting into the fight fast and bloody. Deon had the option to sit back on a pension she received for her service in Russia, but yeah, she chose to lead the charge in war, because of course she did, because she clearly enjoyed living on the edge. Her unit was called up to service in the 7-Year War, a nightmarish war on a global scale that resulted in the death of around 1 million people. It has since been described by several historians as World War Zero, and it's hard to argue with that. The war had two sort of sides, one led by the Kingdom of Great Britain, and the other headed by the Kingdom of France, who were looking to expand their colonies and basically take a whole bunch of shit of other people. Deon's role in the war culminated in her participation in the Battle of Willinghausen in July 1761. Willinghausen is what would have become Welver, a town in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. The battle was a disaster for France and her allies, but France continued to fight, utilising sizable funding from Spain until the money ran out and France sought to make peace. During the Battle of Willinghausen, Deon was injured but survived and was appointed the secretary to the Duc de Nivernais and was sent to England to help craft a peace agreement. The war officially came to an end in 1763, and a month later Deon was officially knighted, receiving the Order of St. Louis and being granted the title of a chevalier. Basically, this woman was a goddamn badass, and she did all of this whilst living as male. Deon stayed in London where she served as an interim ambassador after her old boss returned to France. It was here that she continued to spy for King Louis XV. She was ordered to gain as much intel as possible for a potential invasion of Great Britain by France, in spite of the fact that they had just had their asses handed to them in the 7-Year War, and nobody but the king wanted the invasion, needed the invasion, or would have thought it was a good idea if they had known what the king's intentions were, which were a deadly secret. Nobody knew about these mooted invasion plans, and this would come into play later. In spite of all the clandestine nonsense, Chevalier Deon seemingly enjoyed her time as interim ambassador, attending parties and getting in with the English nobility during the days, whilst at night she worked with various French spies on looking for weak points in England's defences. During this time she was spending far, far more than she was making, partying and living the high life, and began to accrue a ridiculous amount of debt from living the high life. All the good times came to a crashing halt with the arrival of the new ambassador from France, the Comte de Guerchy, in October of 1763. Chevalier Deon was demoted and found herself in the middle of a political brouhaha as factions inside the French government and the royal infrastructure were manoeuvring against each other. Deon decided, now that basically her good life was sort of coming to an end, she wanted to return to France. But this was against the king's orders. And she wrote a letter to the king accusing de Guerchy, her new boss, of trying to drug her at a fancy dinner in London. There is no recorded evidence of this ever happening. The king was livid. at Deon's disregard for orders that he had issued, and immediately stopped the pension she had been receiving for her service in Russia. In an attempt to maintain at least some of the lifestyle she had become accustomed to, she had published several secret communications documents with the threat of publishing the secret orders to find weak spots in English defences for the secret invasion plans. Deon, clearly at this point, did not give a fuck, as her demotion had totally humiliated her and cut her off from the life she was thoroughly enjoying. And she decided her best way to do this was to blackmail the King of France. On top of all this, she went on to sue her old boss for attempted murder. Again, there is no evidence that the drugging incident ever took place. The case never got anywhere, but Deon continued to speak out against her old boss, calling him unfit for his job on top of the accusations of attempted murder. This caused de Guerchy to sue the Chevalier for libel. Offering no defence, Deon went into hiding. This went on until Guerchy was recalled to France in 1766, and Louis XV bought Deon's silence with an annual pension of 12,000 livres. Deon, still clutching the incriminating invasion prep order in her hands, demanded 100,000 livres to pay off her debts. The king said no, and told Deon that she could still work for his spy ring in England, but she could never return to France, ever. She would have to live in political exile in England. So not only did she sort of blackmail the King of France, she then tried to extort him for a ridiculous amount of money to basically cover her partying costs. Whatever you want to say, this girl definitely had some guts.
She did.
King Louis XV died in 1774, and his secret spy organisation died with him, giving Deon a chance to return to France. It was at this point that she declared to the world that she had actually been assigned female at birth, and demanded to be recognised as such, arguing that her ability to quote-unquote disguise herself as a woman was a great service to France during her time in Russia. The new king, imaginatively titled Louis XVI, decided to officially recognise Deon as a woman, and allowed her to return to France on the condition that she would wear women's clothes and live the rest of her life as a woman. In 1777, she returned to France, but was banished to her hometown of Tonnerre. For the next few years, she attempted to get back into military life to try and raise her station. But she was repeatedly turned down, including her attempts to try and join the French troops in the American Revolutionary War. Eventually, in 1785, she decided to move back to England, where she would have more freedom and she had some renown and links to nobility. After the French Revolution, Deon's pension, her only source of income, was stopped, and she had to resort to selling her possessions and making money in fencing tournaments until she was gravely wounded during one such tournament in 1796. She spent the rest of her life in poverty and died after 4 years of being bedridden in 1881. Her gender identity during her life was hotly debated. In England, there was a betting pool at the London Stock Exchange where people bet on what her situation really was. The surgeon who examined her after death revealed that she had, quotes, in quotes, male organs in every respect perfectly formed, whilst also having some feminine characteristics. There has been some debate on whether she was intersex, but honestly she spent the last third of her life identifying as a woman after being assigned male at birth, and claimed to have been assigned female at birth. Some would say to try and get back into France, but clearly this was more of a I'm a woman situation. The Chevalier Deon would and could be described as a trans woman using today's terminology. Havelock Ellis, an English doctor who studied sexuality and gender in the late 1800s and early 1900s, coined the term Aeonism after her, a word that was used widely to describe what we would call transgender identity today, albeit in old-timey nonsense terms around the idea that Aeonism is a condition that occurs when men love women too much, to the point of wanting to be one. So basically it's sort of the forerunner to the autogynephilia myth, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It should also be noted that Ellis was a fucking eugenics-loving nightmare scumbag of a man, but his studies on Aeonism laid the groundwork for what we know about gender identity today. And while she was born to relative privilege, one thing is for sure, this is a trans woman who fucking lived. War veteran, spy, noblewoman and knight. She held the King of France to ransom in a high-stakes game in an attempt to live the life she wanted. And I think that is something that most trans people can sort of relate to.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never had to blackmail the Queen of England to live my truth. But, you know, I've definitely had to do some manoeuvring and perform some politics to get things done. So what do you think of that?
She sounds like an absolute badass. And you did say beforehand that, wow, she had quite the life. And yes, she did. Now, I think this woman's name has cropped up in, I think, a lecture I went to ages ago, where someone was talking about, other sort of trans figures from history, but the story itself and the kind of the things that she did, essentially, it reminds me of somebody else who is not the person that I chose and who I'm going to talk about, but we've spoken about very briefly in our previous historical episode when we were speaking to Morgan Page, Roberta Cowell. Do you remember her?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so she was a fighter pilot during the Second World War and then became a racing driver thereafter, having transitioned amongst massive sensation in the 80s, and I'm pretty sure that, not the 80s, way before the 80s, but a newspaper described her as a sex-change Spitfire ace or something similar. But she also, the phrase that stuck with me when you were talking just then was that she seemed to like to live on the edge, and absolutely, yes, clearly. And so there's, it's interesting, isn't it? Badass trans women of history. I'm totally here for it.
Yeah, where I got most of my research done, I got most of it from the various places online that people usually do, but the only real recorded things about her early life were written by Bram Stoker in a series of essays about famous impersonators.
Right.
Which I thought was really strange. Mm. And also, I think my favourite part of doing research of this was that the 10th Doctor actually met her in one of the audio plays.
Nice. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it's actually like David Tennant doing the voice and stuff. And, there's a wonderful bit in what I could only listen to certain parts of it online because I couldn't afford to buy the thing because it's like 20 quid.
Yeah,
those Doctor Who audio plays are not cheap.
Yes.
But he basically said, well, she's a woman now, right here, and clearly she is a woman in front of us. And, gender is kind of an archaic concept in many ways. So this woman is a woman. And, Billy Pabbers Rose is like, all right, then cool. And for the rest of the thing, they refer to her as she would want her to be, which is as a woman. So, yeah.
Job's a good one.
I think that if you get a Doctor Who audio play in your name, dedicated to you, you've done something right in life.
Yeah, absolutely. If you pop up in Doctor Who hundreds of years after you lived, I think you've done a thing, well, perhaps not right, but certainly well enough to be noted. So fascinating story. So, Chevalier Dion, was it?
I think it's Chevalier d'Eon.
D'Eon. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, look him up. We'll make sure to include the spelling of that in the description. And, her birth name, Charles
Charles Guinevere Louis Auguste André Timothy d'Eon de Beaumont.
That's quite a name, isn't it? You could probably pick several bits.
That's too many names.
You could pick several bits of it and give names to 6 people, couldn't you, really, if you just divvy them all out a little bit more fairly.
For the rest of her life, she was just referred to as, Chevalier d'Eon, the Chevalier, basically.
Chevalier. Yeah. Fascinating. Well, so the person I've chosen is a little bit more recent, in fact.
Ooh.
Yes, well, so I looked at Roberta Cowell, interestingly enough, simply because she had come up before, and there was a couple of, I wasn't sure whether you'd be looking at somebody who was trans, who was like a trans woman or a trans man, or identified in some other way, because obviously that's not what the terminology would have been at more or less any point in the past, really.
Honestly, I just basically found the one that was a spy, and that was it.
Good call. So I started doing a bit of research, but then on February 21st, on the sort of back end of February, over the last few days, after we decided we were going to do the thing, but before we'd recorded it, a woman named Jackie Shane passed away. And Jackie Shane is my choice for this little historical episode. And Jackie Shane was born in 1940 in Tennessee. In fact, in Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, essentially, born during the Second World War. And she is here on our list because of the way she presented herself during her singing career, which was, she's basically considered to be something of a pioneer performer for transgender people, essentially. So she as I mentioned, she was born in 1940. So during the Second World War, during the Second World War in Europe, the Americans hadn't bothered to join in. But so she started performing locally in the 1950s, and she did so wearing traditional feminine trappings, shall we say, long hair, makeup, jewelry, etc. But she was also black. So Jackie Shane, a black woman growing up literally in the Jim Crow South, and she wanted to escape. So in the late 1950s, she's joined a traveling carnival, and after months of traveling around North America, finally arrived in Cornwall in Ontario in 1959 in Canada. In Cornwall, Ontario in Canada in 1959, where apparently she said she felt free for the first time. So in 1960, Shane actually moved to Canada, and there's a story regarding her soulful singing, and a local, slightly legendary saxophone player who's Herbert Whittaker, who's also known as King, invited her along to watch this band called Frank Motley and his Motley Crew. Yeah, seriously, like Motley Crue. But not like Mutley Crue, the metal ones, like as an actual thing. So she went along to the gig, sat down near the front. The lead singer said, "Hey, get that kid up here and let's see what he can do." So up Shane went on stage, still presenting as a man at this point, and performed songs by Ray Charles and Bobby Bland and various others. With the upshot being that soon she was the lead vocalist of the Motley Crue, and then touring around. She returned a whole bunch of times to the United States from whence she came. They recorded in Boston. They recorded in New York. She obviously visited family and friends and so on. And there was a kind of mythology about her in Canada that she was actually involved with, in some way, Little Richard. Okay? So there were claims that she'd been his backing vocalist before moving out to Canada, or that she was actually one of his relatives. But no one's been able to verify either of those claims, and there hasn't been any evidence uncovered that shows that Jackie Shane made those claims herself. So it was actually... There was a music critic many years later called Carl Wilson who suggested that while in reality Shane had deep and identifiable roots in the traditions of the southern US Chitlin circuit, that mythology surrounding Little Richard emerged because that scene's knowledge and traditions weren't known to people from Toronto in the 1960s. So that kind of link that was made, and so that was the only kind of antecedent for Shane's style that local fan base could identify. So throughout this career that she had, right, which went on for several years, she was written about by almost all of the sources as a man, but one who performed in ambiguous clothing that strongly suggested femininity. There were only a few sources that actually wanted to ask her about it, and who sought out her words on the subject of her own gender. So she identified herself as male in two early quotes to the Toronto Star, but more often, and so the majority of the interviews I've read with Jackie, and there really are not many of those, she dodges questions about her gender completely. She just manages to beautifully sidestep it. And the fact that her identity as a trans woman wasn't actually confirmed by anybody on the record until 2017, right? So, wow. Right? So this is a trans woman of colour in the 1960s being a soul singer, going out there, performing, and making waves for doing so, and deliberately being ambiguous when being asked the question that you would, of course, be asked. But here's the fun thing, right? So one of the most well-known recordings that she did was a song called Any Other Way, which had been written and released by a guy called William Bell earlier on in 1962, right? So Jackie Shane recorded a version of this self-same song, which then ended up on the charts itself in 63. But this song contains a lyric, "Tell her that I'm happy, tell her I'm gay." Okay? So obviously the original lyric means like the old way of saying gay, as a way of saying happy. But Shane deliberately played on the double meaning, which at that point in the early 1960s was not in mainstream usage. It was being used by organizations like the Mattachine Society by saying, well, we're not homosexuals, which sounds too medical, we're gay. And so there was a secret meaning to that. And so the lyric, that song, that recording of it, rather, if you compare the two, the William Bell and the Jackie Shane one, she is definitely putting that spin on it for those who know how to listen for it. But then, I don't think Jackie Shane had quite the same level of intrigue and astonishment that Chevalier d'Eon did, but yeah, she was, I'm not sure to what extent she was influential, and in fact, really, I only heard of her a couple of years ago, as someone did a sort of retrospective and said, hey, look, you guys, do you know there was a trans woman of colour soul singer in the 1960s, and who is still alive? But that's the thing, she faded away from the public eye roughly in sort of the early part of the 1970s, and after that, there were so many rumours around that she died, that she'd moved elsewhere, that she'd gone somewhere else, and she was rumoured to have killed herself or to have been murdered in the 90s, but she'd retired and just moved home to Nashville, right? And she stayed in touch with her old bandmate, I think it came up a couple of times where they was talking about staging a reunion concert, but it just, unfortunately, just never materialised. And apparently when this bandmate who'd suggested it tried phoning her back on the same number that he'd used, the phone number had been reassigned to somebody completely different who'd never heard of Jackie Shane. So there was a whole documentary that was made about her, right? In 2010, there was a documentary feature by CBC Radio, I Got Mine, the story of Jackie Shane, which was made in 2010. And nobody involved in that documentary, and the executive producer of which was one of the old bandmate's wife, had been able to find out whether she was still alive. But she was still alive and living in Nashville, up until just a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, Jackie fucking Shane, right?
It's just so strange that there is so much documented stuff about the Chevalier d'Eon, but this woman who was alive very recently, doesn't sound like there's a lot about her post 70s.
Yeah, no, there isn't, and she sort of disappeared from it, and there was sort of people did get in touch with her to interview her during this time, people who were able to get in touch with her to interview her, and she was always ambiguous. Completely ambiguous, not just about her gender, but do you think you'll make a comeback? Well, never say never, darling, and words to that effect. So when she passed away, interestingly, The Guardian, who we've been extremely critical of on previous occasions, have put together this absolutely wonderful obituary for her, which, contains a couple of videos, but absolutely, if there's one thing that I suggest you should go and do, is to check out some of her music. It's on Spotify, it's on YouTube. That song, Any Other Way, I think it should become something of a cult trans classic. It's beautiful, it's soulful, she had a wonderful voice, and I'm glad she used it the way she did. And in a sense, I'm sorry it's not more well known, but then clearly that's not what she wanted. So, yeah. Alright, rest in peace, Jackie Shane, you magnificent, human.
Well, I'd heard the name, but I did not know anything about her. I kind of heard that she died recently.
Well,
I didn't really know who she was. I think, yeah. Well, that's such a fascinating story, and that's a strange thing with trans history is there's so many
fascinating
gaps. Things. And it tends to be most of the stories that I found in my research tended to be about trans women, which was a shame because it turned out this episode, this history section, has been, entirely trans women, which I was kind of hoping it wouldn't. But then maybe next time we should do a trans guy special. What do you think?
I wonder if next time we should be a little more, because we said, okay, let's not tell anybody, let's not set any rules on it, just pick a trans person from history, and we both went for trans women. So I think next time if we say, okay, we've got rules this time, look for somebody like this, or find somebody from the 18th century, or whatever. But this was a fun little project. I learned a whole bunch. For example, a bit that's on my bullet points here that I completely forgot to read out is that she actually turned down an offer to play on the Ed Sullivan Show, right, a famous American music show, but she refused to do so because the booking was made conditional on her presenting as a man. And right, and she said, no, I'm not doing that. And then many, many years later on, she even she turned down an offer in the early 1970s to be part of George Clinton's band, Parliament Funkadelic, right? And had I been alive in the 70s and been offered to join George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic, I would have torn off whoever's limbs, to do that. I would have jumped at the chance. And she's just like, no, I'm fine, darling. You guys get on with it. And it's like, wow, like that's some cool there. I think that's some style. And hopefully that's how we leave you, with a little bit of style, with a bit of thought and a bit of soul in your heart, and some interesting research projects for Jackie Shane and the Chevalier Dion.
I think that wraps up this show. If you liked what you heard, and give us a tweet on @whatthetrans. Let us know what you think. If you have any interesting takes on the current prison situation involving that unit, or any insights into the NHS situation, please get in touch. You can get in touch with us on the Facebook /whatthetrans. You can get us on the Twitter. You can get us on Tumblr, whatthetranspod.tumblr.com. Do get in touch and tell us what you thought of the show. And
and thank you as ever for listening to us ramble on, and we shall see you in hopefully 2 weeks' time, because I'm not moving house, and hopefully Michelle's jaw will remain intact. So until then, look after yourselves, look after each other, and we will see you soon.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.